Wait, I didn't do anything wrong!
I warned you. Now you have to pay.
Cops tased a 93-year-old vet at a bus stop. 6 minutes later, black SUVs flooded the block. The morning sun cast long shadows across the bus stop on Maple Street as 93-year-old Harold Hank Thompson sat quietly on the worn metal bench, his weathered hands resting on his walking cane. Despite his advanced age, Hank maintained the straight-backed posture of a man who had spent decades in military service, though his body now bore the accumulated weight of nearly a century of life. Hank wore his favorite cardigan, a faded blue sweater that his late wife Margaret had knitted for him 20 years ago, over a crisp white shirt and pressed slacks. Around its neck hung a small pendant that most passers-by wouldn't recognize the distinguished flying cross earned during his service as a B-17 bomber pilot in World War II. He had flown 35 missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, each one a dance with death that had claimed too many of his fellow airmen. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Hank took the city bus to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center for his routine checkups and physical therapy sessions. At 93, he was one of the last surviving members of his bomber crew, and these medical appointments were essential for managing the arthritis, hearing loss, and other ailments that were the inevitable companions of extreme old age. The bus stop was located in a transitional neighborhood that had seen better days. Recent budget cuts had reduced police patrols, but increased reports of petty crime had made some officers more aggressive in their approach to anyone they deemed suspicious. For some younger officers, an elderly man sitting alone at a bus stop might appear to be loitering or potentially involved in drug activity. Officer Derek Walsh was having a particularly stressful morning. The 28-year-old patrol officer had been with the department for only 3 years, and he was under pressure from his supervisors to show more initiative in addressing the neighborhood's crime problems. Walsh had grown up in suburban comfort and had little experience interacting with elderly people or veterans. His training had emphasized officer safety and quick decision-making, but had provided limited guidance on de-escalation techniques or recognizing vulnerable populations. As Walsh drove past the bus stop, he noticed Hank sitting alone and decided to investigate. In Walsh's inexperienced judgment, an elderly man sitting by himself at 8:30 a.m. seemed suspicious. He had no way of knowing that Hank had been taking this same bus route twice a week for the past 5 years, or that the elderly man was a decorated war hero who had risked his life for his country. Hank noticed the police cruiser pulling up and felt a familiar tightness in his chest. His generation had been raised to respect law enforcement, but recent news stories about police interactions with elderly and disabled people had made him somewhat apprehensive about unexpected encounters with officers. What neither Hank nor Officer Walsh knew was that this routine Tuesday morning was about to become a defining moment that would expose systemic problems in police training and trigger a response that would reach the highest levels of government. Officer Walsh parked his cruiser and approached the bus stop with the swagger of someone trying to project authority beyond his years and experience. His hand rested casually on his utility belt near his taser, as he had been trained to do when approaching potentially unpredictable situations. "Morning," Walsh said, his tone more interrogative than friendly. "What are you doing here?" Hank looked up with the patient expression of someone who had learned to navigate bureaucracy and authority during his military service. "Good morning, officer. I'm waiting for the number 42 bus to the VA Medical Center. I have an appointment at 9:30. Walsh studied Hank's appearance, noting the elderly man's neat clothing and calm demeanor. But his training had emphasized that appearances could be deceiving. "Do you have identification?" "Of course," Hank replied, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket for his wallet. His movements were deliberate and careful, partly due to his age and partly because he understood the importance of not making sudden movements around armed officers. As Hank fumbled with his wallet, his arthritic fingers making the simple task more difficult than it once was, Walsh's impatience grew. The young officer had been taught that delays and hesitation could indicate deception or the concealment of weapons or drugs. "Hurry up," Walsh commanded, his voice taking on an edge that made Hank's hands shake slightly. "I'm moving as fast as I can, son," Hank said gently. "These old fingers don't work like they used to." Walsh interpreted Hank's slow movements and mild tremor as potential signs of drug use or nervous deception. His training had not adequately prepared him to recognize the normal physical limitations of extreme old age or the effects of combat-related trauma on elderly veterans. "Step away from the bench and put your hands where I can see them," Walsh ordered, his voice now loud enough to attract attention from nearby residents. Hank was confused by the escalation, but complied as best he could, using his cane to help himself stand. "Officer, I'm not sure what the problem is. I'm just waiting for my bus to the VA hospital." "Don't move," Walsh shouted as Hank adjusted his grip on his cane. The walking cane, a simple wooden stick with a rubber tip, was perceived by Walsh as a potential weapon. His training had emphasized that any object could be used to harm an officer, and his inexperience prevented him from recognizing the difference between a mobility aid and a threat. "Sir, this is my walking cane," Hank explained patiently. "I need it to stand and walk. I'm 93 years old." But Walsh was now operating on adrenaline and poor training rather than common sense. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground." Hank stared at the young officer in disbelief. "Son, I can't get on the ground. I have arthritis and hip replacements. And this isn't a weapon, it's a medical device." Walsh's response was to draw his taser. "Get on the ground now, or I'll make you get on the ground." The situation had escalated far beyond any reasonable response to an elderly man waiting for a bus. Hank, drawing on decades of military experience in high-stress situations, tried one more time to de-escalate. "Officer Walsh?" Hank said, reading the name tag, "I'm a World War II veteran. I flew B-17 bombers over Germany. I'm not a threat to anyone. I just need to get to my medical appointment." But Walsh was beyond listening to reason. His training had taught him that compliance was non-negotiable, and Hank's inability to get on the ground was interpreted as defiance rather than physical limitation. "Last warning," Walsh shouted, raising his taser. What happened next would be captured on multiple cell phone cameras and security footage, creating a viral video that would spark national outrage and trigger a response from the highest levels of government. The Taser deployment was as shocking to witnesses as it was to Hank Thompson. The 93-year-old veteran collapsed immediately, his body convulsing as 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through his frail frame. His walking cane clattered to the sidewalk beside him as he fell, and his distinguished Flying Cross pendant scattered across the concrete. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, who had been watching from her apartment window across the street, immediately began recording on her phone while calling 911. There's an officer attacking an elderly man at the bus stop on Maple Street. He just tased a 93-year-old man who was just sitting there. Other witnesses emerged from nearby buildings drawn by Walsh's shouting and the commotion. Several people began recording, creating multiple angles of the incident that would later prove crucial in establishing exactly what had happened. Officer Walsh, realizing that the situation had spiraled completely out of control, called for an ambulance while trying to justify his actions over his radio. Dispatch: I've deployed my taser on a non-compliant subject at the Maple Street bus stop, requesting EMS for medical evaluation. Hank lay on the sidewalk conscious but disoriented and in significant pain. The electrical shock had aggravated his arthritis and caused muscle spasms throughout his elderly body. As he tried to speak, his voice was weak and shaky. My pendant," he whispered, reaching toward the distinguished flying cross that had fallen near his head. Walsh, still operating under the assumption that he had been justified in his actions, began searching through Hank's belongings. When he opened Hank's wallet, he found not just identification, but a military retiree ID card, a VA medical card, and a small laminated card, identifying Hank as a Distinguished Flying Cross recipient. For the first time since the encounter began, Walsh felt a flicker of doubt about his actions. The documentation clearly identified Hank as exactly what he had claimed to be, a 93-year-old World War II veteran on his way to a medical appointment. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the paramedics immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Tasing an elderly person was extremely dangerous and could cause heart problems, broken bones from falling, or other serious complications. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" asked paramedic Sarah Chen as she began her assessment. "Harold Thompson," Hank replied weakly. "Staff Sergeant 8th Air Force 91st Bomb Group. Serial number 37458-291. Even in his disoriented state, Hank's military training caused him to recite his service information, a response that had been drilled into him during World War II in case he was ever captured by enemy forces. Sarah Chen looked at Officer Walsh with barely concealed disgust. "Officer, this man is 93 years old. Tasing someone his age could have killed him. What possible justification did you have for using force against an elderly veteran?" Walsh was beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake, but his pride and training prevented him from admitting error. He was non-compliant and refused to follow lawful orders. "What lawful orders?" demanded Mrs. Rodriguez, who had approached the scene. "I saw the whole thing from my window. That man was just sitting on the bench waiting for his bus, same as he does every Tuesday and Thursday." As the paramedics prepared to transport Hank to the hospital, one of them noticed something that would prove to be crucial. Hank's VA medical card contained an emergency contact number that was different from typical family contact information. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah Chen said gently, "your emergency contact is listed as DoD Veterans Affairs Liaison. Is that correct?" Hank nodded weakly. "Colonel Martinez. She handles special cases." What the paramedics didn't know was that Colonel Maria Martinez was not just any VA liaison officer. She was the Pentagon's senior advocate for elderly veterans and a direct advisor to the Secretary of Defense on issues affecting World War II veterans. More importantly, she had been personally assigned to monitor the welfare of the remaining Medal of Honor and Distinguished Flying Cross recipients from World War II. When the hospital called the emergency contact number, they reached Colonel Martinez's direct line at the Pentagon. The colonel was in a meeting with senior Defense Department officials when her secure phone rang with the emergency alert. "Colonel Martinez, this is Mercy General Hospital in the city. We have Harold Thompson here. He's been injured in an incident with local police." Colonel Martinez's blood ran cold. Harold Thompson was one of only 12 surviving Distinguished Flying Cross recipients from the 8th Air Force, and he was under special protection status due to his age and service record. "What kind of incident?" she demanded. "Ma'am, he was tased by a police officer while waiting for a bus to his VA appointment. He's stable, but he's been seriously injured." Colonel Martinez immediately activated emergency protocols that had been established specifically for protecting elderly veterans. Within minutes, she had contacted the Secretary of Defense, the FBI, and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. The response would be swift, overwhelming, and would forever change how law enforcement agencies approached interactions with elderly veterans. The emergency protocols activated by Colonel Martinez set in motion a response that no one at the local level could have anticipated. Within 6 minutes of her call to the Pentagon, a convoy of black SUVs was racing through the city toward Mercy General Hospital, carrying federal agents, military investigators, and Justice Department officials. The lead vehicle contained FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Officer Walsh and Colonel Martinez herself, who had immediately boarded a military aircraft from Washington, D.C. The colonel's presence indicated the seriousness with which the federal government viewed attacks on elderly veterans, particularly those with distinguished service records. At the hospital, Hank was being treated for electrical burns, muscle strain, and the psychological trauma of the incident. Despite his physical pain, his primary concern was missing his VA appointment and the disruption to his carefully maintained routine. Dr. Hank said to the attending physician, "I need to call the VA and reschedule my appointment. They get upset when veterans miss appointments without notice." Dr. Patricia Williams, who was treating Hank, was amazed by his concern for bureaucratic procedures even after being assaulted by police. "Mr. Thompson, I think the VA will understand given the circumstances. You've been the victim of police brutality." Meanwhile, Officer Walsh was at the police station trying to write his incident report while his supervisor, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, reviewed the witness statements and cell phone videos that were already circulating on social media. "Walsh, what the hell were you thinking?" Sergeant Rodriguez demanded. "You tased a 93-year-old man for sitting on a bench. Sarge, he was non-compliant. He refused to get on the ground when ordered, and he was carrying what appeared to be a weapon. A walking cane, Walsh. He was carrying a walking cane because he's 93 years old and needs assistance walking." The police department's phone lines were already being overwhelmed with calls from outraged citizens who had seen the videos online. The incident was trending on social media with hashtags like veteran abuse and police accountability. Chief of Police Robert Thompson, no relation to Hank, was in emergency meetings with the mayor and city attorney trying to develop a response strategy before the situation spiraled completely out of control. "Chief Thompson," the mayor said urgently, "this is a public relations disaster. We have videos of our officers tasing a World War II veteran. This is going to be national news within hours." The chief was reviewing the incident reports when his secretary burst into the meeting room. "Chief, there are federal agents here to see you." FBI military investigators, and someone from the Justice Department. The federal response team, led by Special Agent Walsh and Colonel Martinez, entered the police station with the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. Colonel Martinez was in full military dress uniform, her ribbons and decorations indicating decades of distinguished service. Chief Thompson, Special Agent Walsh announced, "I'm Special Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI. We're here to investigate the assault on Harold Thompson, a decorated World War II veteran." Colonel Martinez stepped forward, her expression stern and uncompromising. Chief Harold Thompson is a distinguished Flying Cross recipient who flew 35 combat missions over Nazi Germany. He is under special federal protection status as one of our last surviving World War II heroes. The chief felt his stomach drop. Special federal protection status meant that any assault on Hank could be prosecuted as a federal hate crime with enhanced penalties. Colonel Agent Walsh, I want to assure you that we take this incident very seriously. Officer Walsh has been suspended pending a full investigation. Suspended? Colonel Martinez's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Chief Thompson, one of your officers committed assault and battery against a 93-year-old war hero. Suspension is not adequate. Special Agent Walsh opened her briefcase and removed a stack of legal documents. Chief, we're serving you with a federal investigation notice. The Justice Department Civil Rights Division will be conducting a comprehensive review of your department's training procedures and use of force policies. The crisis deepened when Colonel Martinez's phone rang with a call from the Secretary of Defense. She stepped aside to take the call, and when she returned, her expression was even more serious. Chief Thompson, I've just spoken with the Secretary of Defense. This incident has been reported to the President. Harold Thompson will be receiving a personal call from the Commander-in-Chief to apologize for this assault on a veteran who served his country with distinction. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A routine police encounter had escalated into a federal incident involving the highest levels of government. Furthermore, Colonel Martinez continued, we will be implementing mandatory training for all law enforcement agencies on proper interactions with elderly veterans. This will never happen again. The federal response to Hank Thompson's assault reached its climax when President Harrison himself arrived at Mercy General Hospital, accompanied by a full presidential security detail and media entourage. The president had been briefed on the incident during his morning security briefing and had immediately ordered a personal visit to apologize to the veteran on behalf of the nation. Mr. Thompson, President Harrison said as he entered Hank's hospital room, I'm here to personally apologize for what happened to you. What Officer Walsh did was completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of our nation or the respect we owe to our veterans. Hank, despite his injuries and medication, struggled to sit up straighter when the president entered. His military bearing remained intact even after the traumatic incident. Mr. President, Hank said with a weak but steady voice, I appreciate you coming, but I don't want this to reflect poorly on all police officers. Most of them are good people trying to do a difficult job. President Harrison was struck by Hank's grace and lack of bitterness despite what he had endured. Mr. Thompson, your generosity of spirit is exactly what I would expect from someone who served our country with such distinction. but we cannot allow incidents like this to happen to our veterans or any citizen. The President's visit was broadcast live on national television, creating a powerful image of the nation's highest official showing respect to one of its oldest heroes. The contrast between the President's reverence and Officer Walsh's brutality could not have been starker. Colonel Martinez briefed the President on the broader implications of the incident. "Sir Harold Thompson represents something precious that we're losing the living memory of World War II. There are fewer than 300,000 World War II veterans still alive, and we lose approximately 300 of them every day. Each one carries irreplaceable stories and experiences from our nation's greatest generation." The President nodded gravely. "Colonel, I want you to develop a comprehensive program to protect our remaining World War II veterans. They've given everything for this country, and we owe them our protection and respect." Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Walsh's actions was revealing systemic problems in police training and accountability. Special Agent Walsh's team had discovered that Walsh had received minimal training on de-escalation techniques and had never been taught to recognize the special needs of elderly or disabled individuals. Agent Walsh, Chief Thompson said during the federal briefing, "I'm beginning to understand that this incident represents failures at multiple levels of our organization. Officer Walsh's actions were inexcusable, but they were also the result of inadequate training and supervision." The federal investigation had also revealed that Walsh's aggressive approach was not an isolated incident. Several other complaints had been filed against him for excessive force, but they had been dismissed or inadequately investigated by department supervisors. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been treating Hank, provided medical testimony that highlighted the severity of the assault. Tasing a 93-year-old man could have caused cardiac arrest, stroke, or fatal injuries from falling. Mr. Thompson is fortunate to be alive. The climax of the federal response came when Attorney General Patricia Chen announced that the Justice Department would be filing federal civil rights charges against Officer Walsh and implementing a consent decree requiring comprehensive reforms of the police department. The assault on Harold Thompson represents a violation of his civil rights and an attack on the values that he fought to defend during World War II. Attorney General Chen declared at a press conference, "We will not tolerate the abuse of our veterans or any citizens by those sworn to protect them." Officer Walsh, facing federal charges and the end of his law enforcement career, finally began to understand the magnitude of his actions. His attorney had advised him that he could face up to 10 years in federal prison for violating the civil rights of an elderly veteran. The most powerful moment came when Hank Thompson, despite his injuries, requested to address the media from his hospital bed. With President Harrison's permission, a brief press conference was arranged. "I want everyone to know," Hank said, his voice still weak, but determined, "that I don't hate Officer Walsh. He's a young man who made a terrible mistake, but I've seen good men do bad things under pressure. What I want is for this to be a learning experience that prevents other elderly people from being hurt." Hank's words broadcast nationally demonstrated the character that had earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross decades earlier. Even as a victim of police brutality, he chose forgiveness over vengeance and education over retribution. President Harrison, standing beside Hank's hospital bed, announced the creation of the Harold Thompson Veterans Protection Act, which would provide special training for law enforcement officers on interacting with elderly veterans and establish federal oversight of police departments with patterns of veteran abuse. Harold Thompson flew 35 missions over Nazi Germany to protect our freedom, the president said. The least we can do is protect him and veterans like him from abuse in their own country. The federal response had transformed a local police incident into a national moment of reckoning about how society treats its most vulnerable and honored citizens. The black SUVs that had flooded the block represented not just federal authority, but the nation's commitment to protecting those who had sacrificed everything for freedom. Colonel Martinez, standing at attention beside the president, announced that Hank would be receiving the Presidential Citizens Medal for his grace under pressure and his commitment to turning his traumatic experience into positive change. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "you have served your country with distinction in war and in peace. Your response to this incident demonstrates the same courage you showed over the skies of Europe 75 years ago." As the president prepared to leave the hospital, he shook Hank's hand one final time. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for your service, and thank you for showing us all how to respond to injustice with dignity and wisdom." 6 months after the incident at the bus stop, the ripple effects of Hank Thompson's assault had transformed law enforcement training across the nation. The Thompson Veterans Protection Act had been signed into law, requiring all police departments receiving federal funding to implement specialized training on interacting with elderly and disabled individuals. Officer Walsh had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for violating Hank's civil rights. But more importantly, his case had become a cautionary tale used in police academies nationwide. The video of his assault on the 93-year-old veteran was now mandatory viewing for new recruits, accompanied by extensive training on de-escalation and recognizing vulnerable populations. Hank Thompson had recovered from his physical injuries, though the psychological impact of the assault had been more lasting. However, he had found new purpose in his role as an advocate for elderly veterans and police reform. He regularly spoke at police training academies, sharing his story and helping officers understand the perspective of elderly citizens. "I tell them," Hank would say during his presentations, "that every elderly person they encounter is someone's grandfather or grandmother. We all have stories, we all have dignity, and we all deserve respect." The police department had undergone comprehensive reforms under federal oversight. Chief Thompson had implemented new policies requiring officers to receive annual training on interacting with elderly and disabled individuals, and the department had established a special liaison program with local veteran organizations. Colonel Martinez had been promoted to head the Pentagon's new Veterans Protection Office, which monitored the welfare of elderly veterans and coordinated with law enforcement agencies to prevent similar incidents. The office had already prevented dozens of potential confrontations through education and early intervention. President Harrison had kept his promise to protect the nation's remaining World War II veterans. The Presidential Citizens Medal ceremony for Hank had been attended by dozens of surviving veterans, creating a powerful symbol of the nation's commitment to honoring its heroes. Most meaningfully for Hank, he had returned to his routine of taking the bus to his VA appointments. But now, the bus drivers knew his story. Fellow passengers treated him with special respect, and police officers who encountered him understood exactly who he was and what he represented. "I'm still just an old man waiting for the bus," Hank would say with a smile. But now people understand that sometimes old men have important stories to tell. The 93-year-old veteran who had been tased for sitting on a bench had become a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the ongoing fight for justice and dignity for all citizens.